Hello, I'm Professor Congleton, and this is Econ 411, Lecture 1B. So today we're going to finish the block on Aristotle, and the kinds of topics we're going to talk about include the ones listed here. We're going to talk a little bit about his theory of virtue. It's an interesting theory. He argues that virtue is not an extreme, not especially an unreachable, impossible kind of a goal for people to aspire to, but rather something that can be reached by everyone with work, practice, and discipline. And generally speaking, virtue is a mean. It's a middle ground between two extremes, which are vices. And this mean way of thinking about virtue is, I think, unique and interesting and worth some thought on in its own right, of course. But it's of interest in this course partly because it affects the way he thinks about other topics that we're covering. The other virtue we're going to talk about briefly is justice. Justice is an exception in the sense that you want to be as just as possible, and it's a type of extreme. Although the thing you aim for it when you're just is some kind of mean, the proper balance of interests that you're taking account of. In his section on justice, Aristotle essentially invents equilibrium economics and uses it to describe what he calls proportionate justice. So trades that take place at long-run equilibrium prices, a term he didn't have, of course, tend to be proportionally just. And so his first discussion of economic matters turns up under justice, of all places. But it's interesting because it implies that there's a kind of fundamental justice to exchange in markets. He also applies his ideas about virtue and happiness when he analyzes career choices. And he has a list of careers that he thinks are kind of most likely to facilitate the development of virtue, good careers, productive careers, and others that he thinks are less likely to do so. And the list is kind of interesting because many of his ideas remain popular even today. And last, we're going to talk about his ideas for good governance. He has a couple of ideas there that are relevant. One is that good governance promotes the happiness of the people who live in the society being governed. And to do that, of course, they have to promote the development of virtues and intellectual excellence. And therefore, he's in favor of public education and laws that kind of reinforce or help to guide people along to develop virtuous habits. He's also an early defender of representative democracy as a kind of middle type of government between the extremes of pure democracy and some kind of aristocracy or monarchy. And so with that introduction to what we're going to be looking at today in somewhat more detail, I'll stop now and I'll switch over to the slides. So here are the slides for today's lectures. This is a picture of, an imaginary picture, of course, of some of the major public buildings that might have been around in central Athens during Aristotle's time. Of course, the entire city didn't look like this. This was the popular or the public square where a lot of resources were devoted. Other parts of the cities were normal, and I suppose for their day, much less made out of stone, much less wide and open, and much less comfortable. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about virtue. As you remember from the previous lecture, practicing virtue is the method that one uses to generate moral excellence in one's character. And so virtue is an important concept in Aristotle's theory of how you become a happy or satisfied person. It's not the only dimension of happiness, okay? But it's an important one, and he emphasizes it in the Nicomachean Ethics. So when he goes through and talks about virtues, he first goes through a list of ones where virtue is a golden mean. That is, it's a mean between a middle point between two extremes, which are widely regarded to be vices, as non-praiseworthy, if you want, blameworthy. So he talks first about courage. Now that is meant a mean state with respect to fear and boldness, as has already been discussed. The objects of our fears are obviously things fearful, or in a general way of statement, evils, which account for the common definition of fear, namely the expectation of evil. We, of course, we feel evils of all kinds: disgrace, for instance, poverty, disease, desolation, death. But not all of these seem to be the object matter of brave men, because there are things which to fear is right and normal, and not to fear is base. So the proper degree of courage, the proper reaction to a situation which might induce fear, varies with the circumstance, and the manner in which you're supposed to react is determined more or less by reason. Another virtue he talks about is liberality, being generous to some extent with one's companions and people that one meets. Now this is a mean state having for its object the matter of wealth. The liberal man is praised not in the circumstances of war, nor in those which constitute the character of perfected self-mastery, nor again in judicial decisions, but in respect to giving and receiving wealth, chiefly the former. That is, liberality has to do with giving things to others. By the term wealth, I mean all those things whose worth is measured by money. The liberal man will give from a motive of honor, and will give rightly, to proper persons in the right proportion at the right times, whatever is intended in the term right giving. And this too with positive pleasure, or at least without pain. For the man who gives to improper people, or not from a motive of honor, but from some other cause, shall be called not liberal or illiberal. And so again, here each of the extremes involves really an excess and a defect contrary to each other. I mean, the prodigal gives out too much and takes in too little, while the stingy man takes in too much and gives out too little. So a couple things interesting about this approach. It says that virtue is not an extreme form of behavior, but rather an appropriately moderate one. And you'll see that that connects back in with self-mastery and meekness as aims of moral development. Whereas the extremes are, in some sense, not consistent with reason. They represent some kind of excessive passion for one thing or another, effective passion for too much safety for one's own safety, too much passion for one's own wealth. And so it conflicts with this idea of moderation and reasonable choice. So the translator is still using this word meek for this moderate form of behavior, and it may well be appropriate for the best word for for him in the time that he was writing, which I find personally interesting. We find the virtuous character meek. We will call the mean state meekness, and of the extremes let the man who is excessive be denominated passionate, and the faulty state passionless, and him who is excessively angry, and the defect angerlessness. So in this situation, Aristotle would not regard Mr. Spock from the old Star Trek series to be virtuous in this sense, because he's excessively passionless. On the other hand, Captain Kirk is probably a little too passionate. So what he has in mind is somewhere in between these two characters, not either one being perfect. With respect to pleasures and pains, but not all, and perhaps fewer pains than pleasures, the mean state is perfected self-mastery, the total absence of the defect, the total absence of self-control. there is a character that takes less pleasure than he ought in bodily enjoyments, such persons also fail to abide by the conclusions of reason. The man of self-control is the mean between him and the man of imperfect self-control. That is to say, the latter fails to abide by them because of somewhat too much, the former because of somewhat too little. The man of self-control and the man of perfected self-mastery have this in common. They do nothing against right reason on the impulse of bodily pleasures, but then the former has bad desires, whereas the latter has not. So self-control implies that you're kind of resisting a temptation, right? So I might myself enjoy eating a box of cookies in the evening, but if I want to keep my weight at the level that I aspire to, I have to resist that temptation, and so I'm drawn to that box of cookies, but I resist it, so I have self-control. Whereas the man of perfected self-mastery, once he realizes he shouldn't be eating cookies, he's no longer interested in cookies. He has no impulse to do this after he's reached a decision that it's the wrong thing to do. And you'll see this idea, by the way, pop up again in the 18th century from Ben Franklin, of all people. So the person of self-mastery is so constituted as not even to feel pleasure contrary to his reason. The former feels, but does not yield to it. I've always thought that was an interesting point of view. And I know people in academia, for example, who have self-control. That is, they can get themselves to get the writing and research and teaching done. But they feel tension between that and other activities that they could be undertaking. Whereas a person who has self-mastery just does it automatically. He doesn't resist, he just does it. And folks who manage to reach that state tend to be highly productive because they don't use up a lot of psychological energy, I guess you'd call it, resisting temptation. So a possible exception to this rule that virtue is a golden mean is justice, which is also where Aristotle takes up economics for the first time in Nicomachean Ethics. We see then that all men mean by the term justice a moral state such that in consequence of it men have the capacity of doing what is just and actually do it and wish it. It's not just a matter of recognizing what is just, but also the motivation to act on that idea. Justice, it must be observed, is not a mean state in the same manner as the aforementioned virtues because it aims at producing the mean, while injustice occupies both extremes. The just, then, is a certain proportionate thing, for proportion does not apply merely to numbers in the abstract, but to numbers generally, since it is an equality of ratios. And so at this point he needs an illustration. In all the other cases where he talks about virtues, he keeps the illustration somewhat abstract. He imagines people in different choice settings, how they would make decisions if they were moral, and how they would make them differently if they were not moral, how they would react if they were self-disciplined, and how they would react if they were not self-disciplined. In this case, he uses a somewhat more specific set of examples, all from market activities. And what's interesting for me is he takes for granted that market activities can be just. Okay, in fact, he expects his readers, his students, to think of market transactions in the same way, because otherwise it wouldn't serve as a very useful example. And so this is one of the background norms that must have been fairly common in Athens at the time, which, as I mentioned in the introduction, was a commercial powerhouse during its prime. And so many people would have been engaged in shipping, many people would have been engaged in producing things for sale, many people would have been engaged in producing products for markets and so forth. So for its day, it was a commercial society. And if it lacked these norms, norms that would tend to support commerce, fair dealing with customers and so forth, and basically disrespected markets, it would be unlikely to have been nearly as successful as it was. So that's consistent. This use of market prices as an example of proportionate justice is consistent with the idea that Athens benefited from normative support for markets during its day. And you'll see his illustrations are all about trading and trading in the right ratios. And those ratios are essentially the relative prices that emerge from in long-run equilibrium. So even though Aristotle in this exercise or the series of illustrations, in a sense, invents a good deal of price theory, he doesn't quite have the full picture that would emerge 2,000 years later with Adam Smith and other people after Smith. But he's very close, and the best way to make sense of this discussion of proportionate justice is if you think of the trading as taking place at long-run equilibrium prices. So, for example, the builder is to receive from the shoemaker of his ware and to give him of his own. If there is proportionate equality, the reciprocity, the reciprocation, the exchange takes place, and there will be a just result of which we are speaking. Now, obviously, you don't trade one pair of shoes for one house, right? That would be unjust. That would be unfair. A lot more work is involved in building a house than a pair of shoes. And so the ratio between trading shoes for houses has to be appropriate and has to be, in some sense, fair. And that ratio is determined in this discussion by long-run equilibrium prices. So if there's proportionate equality, the reciprocation, the exchange takes place, and there will be the just result of which we are speaking. If not, there is not the equal, nor will the connection stand. And so also in the other arts, for they would also have been destroyed entirely if there were not a correspondence in point of quantity and quality between the producer and consumer. Now, the equality that he's talking about is an equality of market value, right? So if it took 100 pairs of shoes to be worth the same amount in the market as one house, then an exchange of one house for 100 pairs of shoes would be proportionately equal, right? And in a sense, there's an equal value being traded, and equality of market value. And this equality aspect of trade plays an important role in Aristotle's theory of just prices, and also in subsequent ideas about fair prices that continue to have impact on public policy today, but were even stronger during the Middle Ages. All things which can be exchanged should be capable of comparison. For this purpose, money has come in and comes to be a kind of medium. It's a medium of exchange and comparison. It measures all things, and so likewise the excess and defect. It determines, for instance, how many shoes are equal to a house or a given quantity of food. So notice in this one short sentence, Aristotle has characterized one of the fundamental propositions of monetary theory, that money is a medium of exchange, it's a measure of value, and in a sense, it's a way of facilitating exchange. In Aristotle's language, it also allows one to determine what fair proportions are, what just proportions are. As the builder to the shoemaker, so many shoes must be to the house, or food if instead of a builder an agriculturalist is the exchanging party. For unless there is this proportion, there cannot be exchange or dealing, and this proportion cannot be acceptable unless the terms are in some ways equal. Let A represent an agriculturist, B, C food, B a shoemaker, D his wares, equalized with A's, then the proportions will be correct. A is to B, a C is to D, and so forth. So these ratios would all be constant across the goods, and one could use them for thinking about proper pricing of goods and services. Now, I mentioned that this would be true in long-run equilibrium in competitive markets, and that's because all rates of returns are equalized at that point. There are no rents or profits in the sense that economists mostly use that term. And in that case, these ratios would all be correct, no matter which trading relationship you were talking about. And there would be a fundamental equality in values when you think of them in terms of goods traded through the intermediary of money. And further, money is a kind of security to us in respect of exchange at some future time, supposing one wants nothing now that one shall have it when we do. All right, so money is also a method of shifting purchasing power from one period to the next. It's a method of savings. And again, that's a fundamental idea in monetary theory that we still have. And you could make a claim that in this one digression, trying to illustrate proportionate justice, Aristotle pioneers monetary theory and general equilibrium in a way that he did just because he needed something to illustrate the notion of proportionate justice, and in a way that was compatible with many ideas already in the minds of people in his community. Now let's move on to implications of virtue for economic activities. First, I'm going to talk about his idea of the choice of careers. And in this section of the ethics, he does not really link it directly back to virtue, but his conclusions make sense when they are linked. And I'm sure that's what he had in the back of his mind. So the useful parts of wealth getting for farmers are first the knowledge of the livestock which are most profitable. For example, what sort of horse or sheep or oxen or any other animals are most likely to give a return. So Aristotle is not opposed to maximizing profit. He thinks that a sensible farmer would know the rates of return of different types of animals and different types of crops and choose among those to try to maximize his profits. So he's not anti-market when he tries to rank careers, but what he's trying to do is think about which careers allow the best opportunities for demonstrating, perfecting virtue, and for adding to one's intellectual excellence. And so. So for that, the aims should be kind of moderate in a sense, right? Even though maximizing profit might be part of those aims. So there's a little conflict in the prose. He actually talks about 3 or 4 kinds of wealth getting, but for some reason he begins with this by claiming there are just 2. One is part of household management, and the other is retail trade. So the former is necessary honorable, where that which consists in exchange is justly censured, for it is unnatural in a mode by which men gain from one another. Now this, I suspect, might be a matter of translations. I haven't checked a lot across translations on this particular phraseology. Because all market activities would be unnatural from his point of view, because you're creating things that weren't already there in nature, and therefore it represents some human-controlled aspect, as opposed to some despicable aspect, with the way that term unnatural is often used today and in the past century. I think his idea is that managing a household, in this case a large farm or something of that sort, many of his students would have been from the rural aristocracy, I suspect, and so this would naturally appeal to them to some extent. That those activities, those market activities undertaken by such a household, such a farmer, such a productive aristocrat, would be necessary and honorable in the sense that they would be contributing to the welfare of everyone in their household. On the other hand, retail trade, commerce per se, sort of wholesaling, shipping, and things of that sort, is done just for money. Right? And it's that just for money that makes it have a lower rank in Aristotle's ranking of career choices. And he believes that kind of just that focus on money would tend to cause one to be avaricious, greedy, and not have the proper kind of liberal, in this non-political sense, attitude towards wealth and money that he recommends as one of the virtues. He talks about something that's not quite as good as farming or producing goods directly from from materials for sale to others. He talks about harvesting things from the earth, things that are growing from the earth, trees, for example, or things that are available in the earth, such as mining. These are most truly arts in which there is the least element of chance. They are the meanest in which the body is the most deteriorated, the most servile, in that there is the greatest use of the body, and the most illiberal in which there is the least need of excellence. So he regards these types of careers as unlikely to generate moral or intellectual excellence, and therefore unlikely to produce happiness, and therefore these are careers to be avoided by most people. These people who are thoughtful and interested in personal development as a route to happiness. And then even below commerce, which you might say is below mining and harvesting things from nature, is commerce, and then below that is usury, loaning money to make money. So that focuses even more attention on money than straight commerce. And so he argues that it's the most hated sort, and with the greatest reason, is usury, as loaning money, which makes the gain out of money itself and not from the natural object of it. For money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase that interest. And this term, interest, which means the birth of money from money, is applied to the breeding of money because the offspring resembles the parents. Of all the methods of getting wealth, this is the most unnatural. Again, given his notion of natural and unnatural that we talked about in the previous lecture, if this phrasing is fair to what Aristotle intended to, it wouldn't necessarily mean that this is nasty, okay? But the first part, the most hated sort, implies that it's the lowest ranking of the four types of careers that he talks about. So the first would be, productive activities where you create something that wasn't there before through your own efforts and take it to market and sell and use the money to support your household. The second would be mining, harvesting timber, and things of that sort, catching fish, I suppose, gathering up things that are produced by nature to use in your own affairs, and also to sell in markets to support your household, family, and so on. And then commerce, in the sense of wholesale purchasing stuff, moving it someplace else, selling it to retailers, that kind of middleman activity. And last, the banks, I guess the financial sector, people who loan money out for interest. And so are really heavily focused on money. And again, he regards that kind of excessive focus on money as non-virtuous, as a vice. And it would be hard to resist in that type of career, I think, and therefore it's the lowest rank. If you think about ranks of careers today, I think the ranks are not quite that hard on banking and finance as they were in his time. But there are still people who regard finance that way. And it bears knowing that in the Middle Ages in Europe, and is still true in many Muslim countries today, charging interest on loans is actually illegal. All right, so that idea influenced public policies for hundreds of years between Aristotle's time and now. So it's not kind of some out of the ordinary idea for history, okay, even though it's a bit excessive and seems a bit out of the ordinary today, especially in a school of business here at WVU. So the next aspect of Aristotle's work we're going to talk about is his ideas about governance. And there are three parts to that. One is his ideas of the basic laws of society, I guess you'd say. Do you have private property or not? Are there reasons to hold things in common? Should everything be held in common or only some part of it? Next would be, what is the aim of a good government? And after that would be, what is the best form of government? The one that's most likely to achieve that aim of governance. So we'll talk briefly about all these things. And then that will close up today's lecture. So first, talking about common property, he's aiming to critique some ideas of Plato's in his Republic, although he doesn't mention Plato by name here. The members of a state must either have all things or nothing in common, or some things in common, some not. So there's a spectrum of possibilities that some things in common and some not in common, with the polar extremes of everything being common or everything being private. That they should have nothing in common is clearly impossible, for the community must at any rate have a common place. One city will be one place, and the citizens who are and citizens of those cities would share in that one city. Property should be, in a common sense, in a certain sense, common, but as a general rule, private. So he's going to make an argument here that although some things have to be common, an idea you'll see pop up in Grotius about 1800 years later. But he's going to make the argument that, generally speaking, everything should be private. Everything that doesn't have to be common should be private. For when everyone has a distinct interest, men will not complain of one another, and they will make more progress because everyone will be attending to his own business. So essentially, this is a kind of practical defense of markets. It doesn't directly, at least at this point, connect back to his ideas about ethics, but simply argues that resources will be better used when they are privately held, because people will be interested in using those to their greatest advantage, and there won't be shirking, infighting among people and so forth, because they can make their own independent decisions. He then connects it back up with virtue a bit and argues that private property also facilitates the development of some virtues, and also could be a source of happiness in its own right, and therefore it's consistent with a good life as he understands it, which is a life in the pursuit of long-run satisfaction or happiness. There is the greatest pleasure in doing a kindness or service to friends or guests or companions, which can only be rendered when a man has private property. These advantages are lost by excessive unification of the state or excessive use of common property rights. The exhibition of two virtues besides is visibly annihilated or wiped out without private property. First, temperance towards women, for it is an honorable action to abstain from another's wife for temperance sake. And secondly, liberality in the matter of property. No one, when men have all things in common, will be any longer can any longer set an example of liberality or do any liberal action, because liberality consists in the use of which is made of one's property. The next section is consistent with some things he expressed about ethics early on, which I didn't mention, namely that ethical theory can never be an exact science because so many ethical choices are context specific and require what he calls practical wisdom to properly assess and make the moral choices in. And he argues that the law has the same property, that you can make general claims, but you know that there are going to be errors, that a general law will always yield some unjust outcomes. that will, and that is inherent in the nature of law, pretty much for the same reason as it's inherent in the nature of ethics, because it's hard to come up with general rules that will apply in every possible context and generate just or moral consequences or outcomes. So the law takes the generality of cases, that is, it tries to be general, being fully aware of the error thus involved, and rightly too notwithstanding, because the fault is not in the law or in the framer of the law, but is inherent in the nature of the thing, because the matter of all action is necessarily such. When the law has spoken in general terms, and there are always exceptions to the general rule, it is proper insofar as the lawgiver omits the case and by reason of his universality of statement is wrong. That is, if he doesn't acknowledge that there are exceptions to the rule, to set right the omission by ruling it as the lawgiver himself would rule were he there present. So it's an interesting, convoluted sentence, but basically it's a defense of original intent in law. That is, the person who wrote the law had something in mind when he wrote it. And when you interpret the law and apply the law as a judge or in a jury, you should interpret the law as the lawgiver would have interpreted himself had he been a judge or in the jury. So it's a tricky thing, again, for reasons I just mentioned, because it's really hard to write down general rules which will apply in every single possible circumstance. So, for example, murder is generally wrong, but killing somebody else to defend oneself or one's country is normally thought to be okay. So now we're going to move from the framing of society, right? So you have these foundational laws, private property, and how you apply rules about crime and other kinds of activities, and necessary for some judgment at the margin, because laws cannot be as precise as would be in some sense ideal, because of the nature of choice settings that people confront. Now we now think about the aim of governance. What is it that a government should do? Okay. So we have now to inquire what is the best constitution for most states and the best life for most men. And so by states, at this point in history, he's talking about city-states. Most governments were at the city level, and there weren't really effective national governments at this point, at least not in Greece. But the same argument would also apply for nation states as those emerged many years later, and for empires, which emerged sooner than nation states. We now have to inquire what is the best constitution for most states and the best life for most men, neither assuming a standard of virtue which is above ordinary persons, nor an education which is exceptionally favored by nature and circumstances, nor yet an ideal state, which is an aspiration only, but having regard to the life in which the majority are able to share. So he doesn't want to think about the best constitution as some kind of unreachable ideal, nor does he want to assume that the people inhabiting and ruling such a government are in some sense exceptionally virtuous or exceptionally wise and well educated. He wants to assume that this is a state to be run by more or less ordinary people who have some moral dispositions, but they aren't necessarily the most strong ones or the most wise ones. The best political community is formed by citizens of the middle class, and that those states are likely to be well administered in which the middle class is large and stronger, if possible, than both the other classes. The other classes being the aristocracy and the poor, I think roughly in terms of their differences in income and education, even at this time. Or at any rate, then either singly, for the addition of the middle class turns the scale and prevents either of the extremes from being dominant. So you can see that this moderation idea carries forward into his ideas about government. that just as virtue is often a middle point between two extremes, he argues that the best government is also a middle point between two extremes, both in terms of the people who should be pivotal, but also in terms of the kinds of policies that should be adopted by such a government. The mean conditions of states is clearly best, for no other is free from faction, and where the middle class is large, there are least likely to be factions and dissensions. So he's worried about factions already, something that James Madison, writing in the Federalist Papers, was also concerned with. But you can see this concern is ancient. It goes way back, well before the Founding Fathers of the United States started to deal with such issues. For a similar reason, large states are less likely to faction than small ones, because in them the middle class is large. So I think I do not have a slide here on his type of government, but we'll see. But he has a couple of policies that he thinks are important, and these are consistent with his theory of the good life. Right? In a sense, a good government should promote the good life for its citizens. And remember, intellectual excellence requires education. The legislator should direct his attention above all to the education of the youth, for the neglect of education does harm to the Constitution. The citizen should be molded to suit the form of government under which he lives, an idea that's kind of loosely in Montesquieu, writing in the 1800s, as we'll see later on. For each government has a peculiar character which originally formed and which continues to preserve it. The character of a democracy creates democracy. The character of an oligarchy creates oligarchy. And as always, the better the character, the better the government. And since the whole city has one end, the encouragement of virtues necessary for happiness and survival, it is manifest that education should be one and the same for all, and that it should be public and not private. Now, you should keep in mind that public education is extremely rare in history. So this is a fairly radical point of view. And it was something that in Athens was probably less controversial than many other places, because education was highly valued in Athens, at least by the upper class and to some extent the middle class of Athens. So if you think about the overall Aristotle story, there are many reasons to study Aristotle that have nothing to do with this course. Right? He was a genius, the founder of many ideas that are still relevant today, a pioneer in so many different fields of study. Really no one else is comparable to, in that respect in history that I know of, at least certainly not in the history of the West. And he had an enormous impact among intellectuals. You would be hard pressed to find someone who influenced as many generations of thoughtful persons and served as points of departure for so many economic and philosophical arguments and theories many, many years later. Some of his peers might count in that group. Plato is also still highly regarded, one of his teachers. Geometry was worked out in this period, and so we still look at Euclidean geometry. It was still taught in schools, more than 2,000 years after Euclid began working it out, at roughly the same time. So there are reasons to study Aristotle that are independent of this course, but for this course, he is important because of his contributions to economics and his ideas about ethics, which are still, I think, important in the West and have influenced the development of the legal system as well as subsequent theories of ethics. We're not quite as interested in his conclusions about careers, except insofar as they influence so many other people for the next 1,000 or 2,000 years. Because we're not really focused on the economics of Athens. Right? So that's less relevant for this course. It's more or less using him as kind of a foundational character, somebody who made contributions to ethics and in economics, and showed how you can use ethics to think about economic issues and vice versa. It is also not to say that his ideas are universally still regarded to be correct. He's been in some sense surpassed by many developments, and certainly in all the physical sciences and biology, although this took almost 2,000 years to occur. And also some of his conclusions about public policies, which, as for example with slavery, would be controversial. Although it's to be fair to Aristotle, his position was probably the moderate position for most of human history between the time he wrote until about 1700, which is to say that too many people were slaves, but that some people were well suited to be slaves. So that slavery was overly large in the communities that he lived in, but that as an institution it was not itself evil. Okay. After 1700, in the West, it was generally concluded that slavery was evil, and steps were gradually taken over the next 150 years to wipe it out in the West, and also to some degree in the rest of the world. But that was a very novel and important break with the past. Slavery, as far as we know, had always been part of societies, going back at least to the Code of Hammurabi in something like 1500 BC. So it was an ancient institution and was common throughout the world. It was not a Western concept. It was a universal way of abstracting or extracting labor from people without properly compensating them for it, I suppose, which made some people relatively wealthy and powerful, and others miserable and as unpowerful as is humanly possible, I suppose. But we're not interested in those kind of things. What we're interested in, again, is his basic ideas about ethics, his ideas about governance, the aim of governance. This idea about the aim of government, you'll see, will reappear among the 19th century utilitarians and still used in welfare economics today in somewhat more analytical and precise mathematical terms. So with that, we'll finish up Aristotle, and we'll press on to around 1500 next time. So we're going to skip forward about 1800 years. And we're going to talk a little bit at first about the late medieval assessment of markets and market processes, and then we'll shift to around 1600 and see how ideas about markets changed in that century. And they had changed radically, as we'll see. So that's all for today. Thank you for paying attention and listening. Remember to take the lecture seriously. And take notes, and of course, since these are pre-recorded, you can easily stop and rewind if you find something that I've gone over a little too quickly for you to write down, or you want to think about again. So take care. I'll see you next time.